The stagecoach lay on its side like a broken animal, wheels still spinning in the Montana wind. 6 bodies. Blood drying black in the dust. And in the middle of it all, a young woman knelt in the dirt with a screaming infant pressed against her chest, refusing to run even though the men who did this could ride back any minute. U.S. Marshal Ethan Cole had seen a lot of brave fools in his time. He had never seen anything like her. If you stay with this story all the way to the end, hit that like button and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far Clara's promise has traveled. Now settle in. This one matters. The wind in the Bitterroot foothills had a particular sound in late September of 1879. It came down off the high country dry and mean, smelling of pine sap and the first hint of snow, and it carried noise farther than a man might expect. Ethan Cole heard the gunshots from almost 2 miles out. He was riding the ridge above Sweetwater Pass, following a trail 4 days cold, when the sound rolled up to him through the timber. 3 quick reports. A pause. Then a ragged volley, maybe 6 or 7 shots fired all at once the way frightened men shoot when they've already decided they're going to die. Then silence. The kind of silence that settles after, where even the birds know to keep quiet. Ethan reined in his bay gelding and sat very still in the saddle. He was 36 years old that autumn, lean the way a man gets when he eats out of a saddlebag for a living, with a face the sun had worked on for too many seasons. There was a thin white scar running from the corner of his left eye down into his beard, a souvenir from a knife fight outside a saloon in Deer Lodge 3 winters back. He wore a dark wool coat that had seen better days, a flat-brimmed hat pulled low, and a federal marshal's star pinned to the inside of his vest where it wouldn't catch the light. The star had belonged to his father before him. Ethan didn't talk about that. He listened a moment longer, then turned the bay off the ridge and started down through the lodgepole pines at a hard trot. He didn't gallop. A man who gallops into trouble he can't see is a man who finds himself dead before he understands why. The trail came out on a flat stretch of road that ran along Sweetwater Creek, and the road was where they'd done it. Ethan smelled the powder smoke first, hanging low in the cold air, sharp and oily. Then he came around the bend and saw the coach. It was on its side in the middle of the road, the lead horses cut from the traces and gone, the rear pair down dead with their legs still tangled in the rigging. The coach itself had been a Concord, the kind that ran the Helena to Bear Creek line 3 times a week. He could see the painted lettering on the upturned side, what was left of it. Holes in the wood the size of his thumb. A door hanging open. He counted bodies as he rode in. The driver was 20 yards from the wreck, face down with his arms thrown out. The shotgun guard was still up in the box, slumped over the rail like a man who'd fallen asleep there. A man in a banker's suit lay halfway out the door of the coach. Another man, older, gray-bearded, was on his back in the road with his hat beside him, as if he'd taken it off to die polite. A woman in a green traveling dress lay where she'd fallen, one arm folded beneath her, the other reaching toward something Ethan couldn't see. 6 bodies. Ethan eased the bay to a halt and ran a slow look across the trees on both sides of the road, hand resting on the butt of the Colt at his hip. Nothing moved, just the wind in the pine tops and a single magpie watching from a deadfall, head cocked. Then he heard the crying. A baby. Not loud. A tired, used-up sort of cry that came from somewhere on the far side of the overturned coach, and underneath it, low and steady, a woman's voice. Talking. Not screaming, not weeping. Talking the way you talk to a thing you mean to keep alive. Ethan stepped down from the bay, drew the Colt, and walked the coach. She was on her knees in the dirt on the far side, between the back wheel and the body of the woman in the green dress. She had the infant tight against her chest, wrapped in a strip of cloth Ethan recognized after a moment as the petticoat she'd torn from her own skirt. Her hands were red to the wrists. Her hair, the color of dark honey, had come loose from whatever she'd had it pinned up with and hung down around her face. There was blood on her cheek where she'd wiped at something. She looked up when his boots crunched on the gravel. He'd expected a scream, or that empty stare people got when the worst thing in the world had just happened and their minds hadn't caught up yet. He got neither. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a wolf when she's already decided she isn't going to give up what she's holding. "Are you with them?" she said. It wasn't a question. "No, ma'am." Ethan held the Colt down at his side, not pointed, but not put away either. U.S. Marshal. My name is Cole. Ethan Cole. She kept looking at him. He could see her measuring him, every inch of him, the dust on his coat and the star she couldn't see and the way he stood. She had gray eyes, not pale, the gray of river stone after rain. You can put the gun away, Marshal, she said. If you were one of them, I'd already be dead. Ethan slid the Colt back into the holster. He didn't put the loop over the hammer. Old habit. How many? He asked. 4, maybe 5. I couldn't see properly from inside the coach. They wore flour sacks over their faces with the eyes cut out. Her voice was steady, but it sat on something underneath that wasn't steady at all. They shot the driver first, then Mr. Brennan in the back, and then everyone they could see through the windows. One of them looked inside. He looked right at me, and then he looked at Emily. Her jaw worked. At Mrs. Brennan. And he saw the baby, and he just laughed. He laughed, and then he, Ma'am? He shot her in the head, Marshal. He shot her holding the baby. Ethan crouched down so he wasn't standing over her. His knees popped. He set his forearms across his thighs and looked at her, level. What's your name? Clara. She took a breath that shook on the way in. Clara Whitfield. Clara, listen to me a second. I know what you're going to say. I don't think you do. You're going to tell me we have to get off this road because they might come back. She tucked the baby tighter against her, and the small bundle made a sound that wasn't quite a cry. I know that. I knew it before you got here. I've known it for an hour. Ethan glanced past her at the trees. An hour was a long time to kneel in the open beside a dead woman with a live child in your arms. Then why are you still here? She didn't answer for a moment. She looked down at the woman in the green dress, and something passed across her face that Ethan had no name for. Not fear, not even grief exactly. Something older than either. Because Emily made me promise, Claire said. Promise what? That I wouldn't leave the baby, no matter what. She lifted her eyes to him again. She was alive for almost 10 minutes after they rode off, Marshal. She had a bullet in her chest, and she couldn't stop coughing blood, and she made me put my hand on Sarah's head, and she made me promise. And I promised, so I am not leaving. Ethan was quiet. He'd been a lawman for 14 years. Before that, he'd ridden 2 summers with the cavalry out of Fort Ellis. He had been in rooms with dying men and women in numbers he didn't like to count, and he had heard a lot of promises made at the edge of things. Most of them got buried with the people who made them. People meant what they said when they said it. Then they got home and life kept moving, and a promise made in a barn with the lantern guttering started to seem like something somebody else had said. He had never in 14 years met a person still kneeling in the dirt an hour later. Miss Whitfield. He kept his voice low and even. I want you to listen to me very carefully. The men who did this, there's a gang working this stretch of country. Garrett Pike and 4 others, last I had count. They're not going to come back for the bodies. They got what they wanted, which I'd guess was Mr. Brennan's strongbox. But there's a tinker's wagon that comes through here on Wednesdays, and there's a freight team out of Helena due tomorrow. They might know that. They might be set up half a mile back in that timber waiting to see who comes to look at what they did. Her eyes didn't waver. Then we should go, she said. Yes, ma'am, we should. I'm going to bury her first. Miss, I am going to bury her first, Marshal. Ethan looked at her a long moment. Then he stood up, dusted his hands on his trousers, and walked back to the bay. He took the folding spade off his bedroll and walked back. He didn't say anything. She watched him. You'll help me. Ground's soft enough by the creek, he said. I'll dig. You hold the baby. We'll do it quick, and we'll do it right. And then we are getting on this horse, and we are riding. Something happened in her face then. Not a smile. Her mouth didn't move. But something behind the gray of her eyes shifted, the way ice shifts on a river when the thaw comes up under it. She nodded once. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet. He walked the woman in the green dress down to the creek bank. Emily Brennan, by Clara's telling. He didn't ask Clara to help him carry her. He laid her in a hollow under a cottonwood where the ground was black and giving, and he dug a grave that wasn't as deep as he'd have liked, but was deep enough that wolves wouldn't find her before her husband could come back for her properly. He worked fast. The light was already starting to go yellow at the tops of the trees. When he was done, he came back for Clara, and Clara stood and walked down to the creek with the baby in her arms, and she stood at the edge of the grave, and she didn't cry. Ethan thought that was the worst part of it, almost. She didn't cry. She looked down at Emily Brennan, and her mouth moved, and Ethan couldn't hear what she said, and he didn't ask. He stepped back and gave her the moment. Then he covered Mrs. Brennan with his own saddle blanket before he put the dirt back, because some part of him couldn't put dirt directly onto a woman's face, even a dead one. He marked the grave with 2 pieces of cottonwood lashed in a cross with a strip of leather, and he carved EB, 1879, into the upright with the point of his knife. It wasn't much. It was what he had. When he was done, he turned, and Clara was watching him. "The others?" she said. "The freight team will be through tomorrow. They'll see to them. We can't bury 6 bodies before dark, and we can't be on this road after dark." She nodded. She understood. That was the thing he kept noticing about her, even then, in the worst hour of her life. She understood things on the first telling. He helped her up behind him on the bay. She rode side saddle, which was awkward without a proper saddle. But she had the baby to think about, and she could not straddle and hold the child both. He took his coat off and wrapped it around her shoulders against the wind. She didn't object. She didn't thank him for it either, and he liked that. There was no time for ceremony. "Hold on tight," he said. "I am. Bear Creek's about 14 miles. We won't make it before dark. There's a homestead I know about 6 miles on, the Hallorans. They'll take us in for the night." "All right." He nudged the bay into a trot, and they left Sweetwater Pass behind them with the magpies coming down out of the deadfalls already. Ok. They rode in silence for almost an hour. The baby had stopped crying. Ethan thought at first she might be dead. He'd seen infants die from less than what Sarah Brennan had been through. The cold, the hunger, the shock of all that noise. He kept listening for her breathing under the sound of the bay's hooves on the road, and after a while he made out the small wet rhythm of it against Clara's chest, and he let some part of himself ease. Clara hadn't said anything. She rode pressed against his back with the child between them, and Ethan could feel her shaking, not crying, just shaking the way a person does when the body finally remembers it was supposed to be afraid 2 hours ago. He didn't make her talk. He'd learned a long time ago that people came back to themselves at their own pace, and pushing them only made it take longer. The sun went down behind the bitterroots in a hard band of red, and the cold came up out of the ground the way it does in that country in the fall, and Ethan was starting to think he'd misjudged the distance to the Halloran place when Clara finally spoke. "Marshall." "Ethan." "Marshall." Her voice was barely above the sound of the wind. "I don't know what to do." He didn't say anything for a moment. "About what?" "About her." "The baby?" "Yes." "Does she have family?" "Her father. Emily said her father lives in Bear Creek. He runs the mercantile," she said. "Charles Brennan." "All right then. Charles Brennan in Bear Creek. We'll get the baby to him. That's the plan." "And then what?" Ethan thought about it. "Then you go on with your life, Miss Whitfield, wherever it is you were headed before all this." "I was headed to Bear Creek." "All right. I have a position there." "Yeah?" "School teacher." There was a letter. They wrote to the territorial office in Helena last spring and asked for a teacher, and the office wrote to my school in St. Louis, and I answered. I came west. On that coach. On that coach. Ethan was quiet a moment. "School teacher in Bear Creek. They've been trying to get a teacher up there for 2 years." "I know." "You know why?" "I know it's a hard town." "It's a hard town, Miss Whitfield. There's been 3 teachers go up there, and 2 of them come back inside the month, and 1 of them didn't come back at all. The schoolhouse roof fell in 2 winters ago, and nobody's fixed it. The mining outfit at Granite Creek pulled out last spring, and half the men in town went with it. The half that stayed mostly drink. There's no church. There's no doctor closer than Helena. The sheriff is a 60-year-old man named Birdsong, who got the job because nobody else wanted it." He shook his head. "I'm not trying to scare you. I am telling you what is so." "I know what is so, Marshall. I read about it." "You read about it, and you still came." "I still came." "Why?" She was quiet a long time. "Because there were no children left in St. Louis who needed me," she said finally. "All my children there had teachers. All of them had homes. The girls I taught, every one of them had a mother who was alive and a father who came home at night and a roof over their heads. And I kept thinking, There are children in the world who don't have any of that. And what was I doing? Teaching French to 12-year-old girls who would forget every word of it the day they got engaged. So I asked God to send me somewhere I was needed, and the letter came 2 weeks later. She had caught herself then. He felt her go still against his back. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know not everyone wants to hear that kind of talk." "I don't mind it, Miss Whitfield. Most people do." "I'm not most people." She didn't answer. They rode another quarter-mile in silence. Then she said, very quietly, "I keep seeing her face." "I know. Emily's face. When she made me promise, there was a piece of her hair stuck to her mouth and she couldn't get it off because her hands were... I keep thinking I should have helped her get the hair off her mouth before she... Miss Whitfield, I keep seeing it. You're going to see it for a long time. There isn't anything I can tell you that's going to fix that. I'm sorry." She drew a breath that caught somewhere in her throat. "You've seen things like this before," she said. "Yes, ma'am." "Does it get easier?" He thought about lying to her. He didn't. "No, ma'am. It gets familiar. That's not the same thing." She didn't say anything else for a while. The Halloran homestead showed up about an hour after full dark, a low pinpoint of yellow light through the timber, then the dark shape of a soddy and a barn and a corral. A dog started up before they were within 100 yards. Ethan called out his name, and Tom Halloran came to the door with a Henry rifle in his hands and a lantern held high. And when he saw Ethan, he lowered the rifle and his face went from suspicious to something close to gentle when he saw the woman on the back of the horse with the baby in her arms. "Lord above, Marshal, what's happened?" "Stage out of Helena, Sweetwater Pass." "Garrett?" That'd be my guess. Tom Halloran was a wiry man with a face the color of saddle leather and a wife named Maud, who was already coming out of the soddy behind him with a shawl around her shoulders. Maud took one look at Clara, and she did not ask a single question. She just walked over and lifted the baby out of Clara's arms with the gentle, efficient grip of a woman who had buried 2 of her own and helped birth a dozen more. And she said, "Get inside, child. Get inside this instant. Tom, get the marshal's horse." Inside the soddy, it was warm, and it smelled of wood smoke and beans, and the close animal smell of human beings living small. There were 2 children asleep in a curtained-off corner. Maud Halloran did not say much, but she had Clara out of the bloodied dress and into one of her own clean wool shifts inside of 10 minutes, and she had warm water on the stove and a corner of bread soaked in milk for the baby, who took it as if she'd never eaten in her life. Ethan sat at the rough plank table with Tom, and they spoke quietly. "How many?" 4 or 5. She wasn't sure. They wore sacks. "That's Pike's bunch. He's been working east of the divide for 2 months now. He hit a freight wagon up on the Mullen Road in August." "I know it." "You going after them?" "I am." "By yourself?" "Got nobody else." Tom Halloran looked at him over the lantern. "Marshal." "Tom." "That young woman over there." Tom nodded toward the corner where Maud was rocking the baby, and Clara was sitting with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on nothing. "She going to be all right?" Ethan watched her a moment. "I don't know yet." "That's an honest answer." "It's the only one I've got." Tom poured him a measure of whiskey out of a clay jug and slid it across the table. "You don't drink, I know that. Take it tonight anyway." Ethan looked at the cup. Then he picked it up and he drank it. And it burned all the way down and sat in his stomach like a small, warm coal, and he set the cup down and he said, "Obliged. You can have the loft tonight. The lady can have the bed. We'll sleep by the fire." "Tom, you'll take it, Marshal, or I'll be insulted." Ethan didn't argue. Bob. He woke before dawn the way he always did, lying in the loft above the soddy, with the smell of old hay around him and the small breathing sounds of the Halloran household down below. He lay there a moment in the dark and listened. Somebody else was awake. He came down the ladder quiet, and he found Clara sitting at the plank table by herself, with a tin cup of coffee in her hands, and her hair brushed and repinned, and Maud's wool shift swapped for one of Maud's plain calico dresses. She had not slept. He could see it in her face. She looked up when he came down, and she gave him the smallest possible nod. "Morning, Marshal." "Morning. I didn't sleep." "I see that." "I tried." "I know." He poured himself a cup from the pot on the back of the stove and sat across from her. The fire was burned down to coals. Out past the small window, the sky was just starting to turn the color of slate. "Marshall," she said, "I have been thinking." "All right. About what comes next?" "You don't have to think about that yet, Miss Whitfield. You can think about it next week." "I have been thinking about it." He looked at her. He waited. "I am going to keep her," Clara said. Ethan set his cup down. "You're going to keep the baby. Until her father can take her. Whatever that requires. A day. A month. If something has happened to him too and he can't, then longer than that. As long as it requires." "Miss Whitfield, I made a promise." "You made a promise to a dying woman to not leave that child. You did not leave that child. You kept that promise from the moment it was made until you handed her to Maud Halloran last night. That promise is kept. You can sleep with a clear, that isn't what I promised, Marshall." He stopped. "What did you promise?" She looked down at her hands around the tin cup. Her hands were clean now. He could see where Maud had scrubbed the blood out from under her fingernails, and where some of it was still there, faint, in the cuticle of her right thumb. "I promised her I would love her," Claire said. "Sarah, Emily made me promise I would love her until she was safe with somebody else who loved her. That's the promise. Not just to not leave, to love her." Ethan didn't say anything for a long moment. "That's a big promise to make to a woman you'd known for what? 6 hours?" "4. I'd known her for 4 hours, Marshall. We boarded the same coach in Helena." 4 hours. "Yes. And you promised her that." "I did." Ethan let out a long breath through his nose. He looked at her across the table in the gray light from the small window, and he saw, for the first time in maybe 10 years, something he wasn't sure how to handle. He had spent his whole adult life on the wrong side of a country full of men who would shoot a woman in the head for what was in a strongbox. He had organized himself, his body, his sleeping and his eating and his praying, around the proposition that the world was a hard place, and the only sane response to it was to be harder. He had stood over a lot of graves, and he had buried a piece of himself in each one of them, and he had not, in a long time, met a person who made him think he might have been wrong about the shape of things. Clara Whitfield, 23 years old, schoolteacher out of St. Louis, with her hair pinned back and her hands trembling around a tin cup of coffee in Maud Halloran's soddy, was making him think he might have been wrong about the shape of things. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer." "All right. Do you understand what kind of place Bear Creek is going to be for a woman alone with a baby that isn't hers, trying to teach school in a town that doesn't want a school?" "Yes." "You understand it the way you understand a thing you've read. I am asking if you understand it in the other way." "I will understand it in the other way soon enough, Marshall." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "I expect you will." She set her cup down and folded her hands. "Will you come with us? To Bear Creek? To make sure she gets to her father." "That was my plan." "And then?" "Then I'm going to find the men who did this. By yourself." "That's my job, Miss Whitfield. By yourself." "Yes, ma'am." She nodded slowly, as if she had expected the answer and was filing it away somewhere. "All right," she said. "When you come back through Bear Creek, if I come back through Bear Creek, when you come back through Bear Creek, Marshall, I would like you to come by the schoolhouse and tell me what happened." "All right. Promise me." He started to say, "I don't make promises," because he didn't. Because he had learned a long time ago that the kind of work he did was no kind of work to be making promises around. He started to say it. And then he looked at her sitting there with her hands folded and the gray light on her face and the dried blood under the cuticle of her right thumb, and the words went somewhere he couldn't get to them. "All right," he said. "I promise." She nodded once. "Then we have a deal, Marshall Cole." Outside, a rooster started up in the Halloran's yard, and the sky over the Bitterroots turned the color of a new bruise, pink and gray at the edges. And somewhere in a curtained-off corner of the soddy Sarah Brennan, 4 months old, the daughter of a dead woman in a green dress and a man in Bear Creek, who didn't yet know he was a widower, made a small sound in her sleep that was not a cry. Ethan finished his coffee. They had a long road in front of them, and the light was coming, and on the other side of the Bitterroots, Garrett Pike and 4 men with flour sacks for faces were riding east through the timber with somebody else's money in their saddlebags, not knowing yet that a young woman in a calico dress had decided, in the dark hour before dawn in a soddy outside Sweetwater Pass, that she was not going to be afraid of them. The bay was saddled by the time the sun came up. Maud Halloran pressed a parcel of biscuits and dried meat into Clara's hands, and kissed the baby on her small fuzzed head, and held Clara by the shoulders a long moment and said something to her that Ethan didn't catch. Clara nodded. Maud nodded back. Then Clara climbed up behind Ethan on the bay with Sarah wrapped against her chest in a clean strip of Maud's flannel, and they turned east toward Bear Creek, and the road bent down through the pines toward a town that did not know yet what was coming for it. They came down into Bear Creek a little after noon. The town sat in a long, shallow draw between two hills that hadn't yet decided whether they wanted to be mountains. A creek ran the length of it, brown with last week's rain. There was a single rutted street with maybe 20 buildings strung along both sides like teeth in a jaw that had taken too many punches. A livery, a blacksmith. Two saloons facing each other across the mud as if they were daring each other to do something about it. A boarding house with a sagging porch. A mercantile with a faded sign that read Brennan's Dry Goods in letters that had been read once and were now the color of old brick. At the far end of the street, set back from the road in a stand of yellow cottonwoods, the schoolhouse Ethan had told her about, with its roof caved in on the north side and the door hanging open on one hinge. Clara took it in without saying anything. Ethan had been watching her sideways since the road came out of the timber. He'd expected her to flinch at the schoolhouse or to go quiet at the look of the place. She didn't. She just looked at it the way a person looks at a wound they mean to dress. "That's the school," he said. "I see it." "You can change your mind, Miss Whitfield." "I have not changed my mind, Marshal." He didn't say anything more. The bay's hooves made a wet sound in the street. A few men were sitting on the porch of the saloon on the left, the one with the painted sign that said, "The Copper Kettle." They watched the horse come down the street with the slow, flat-eyed attention of men who'd had nothing to do since breakfast. One of them spit a string of tobacco juice into the mud and said something to the man next to him. The other man laughed. Neither of them got up. Ethan reined in front of the mercantile. He swung down and reached up to take the baby first, holding her in the crook of his arm while Clara climbed off the bay. Clara took Sarah back without a word and held her close. Sarah was awake. She had her small fist pressed into her mouth and she was making a soft, fretful sound that wasn't quite crying. The mercantile door had a bell on a strip of leather. It jangled when Ethan pushed the door open. Inside it was dim and smelled of coffee beans and tobacco and the close, oily smell of new leather goods. There were shelves to the ceiling on three sides, stacked with bolts of cloth and tinned peaches and bags of flour and coils of rope and a long glass case along the back counter with knives and a few pistols laid out on green felt. A man stood behind the counter writing in a ledger. He was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, going to gray at the temples, with rolled-up sleeves and a leather apron and the strong forearms of a man who'd loaded a lot of freight wagons in his life. He looked up when the bell rang. He saw Ethan first. Then he saw Clara behind Ethan with the baby in her arms, and the pencil in his hand stopped moving. "Mr. Brennan," Ethan said. "Marshal. This is Miss Clara Whitfield. She's the new teacher out of St. Louis." Charles Brennan looked at Clara, then at the baby, then back at Ethan. Something in his face was already starting to figure things out, the way a man's face does when his body knows the answer before his mind has caught up. "Where's Emily?" Ethan took his hat off. "Mr. Brennan." "Where's my daughter, Marshal?" "Mr. Brennan, the stage out of Helena was hit yesterday afternoon at Sweetwater Pass. We believe it was Garrett Pike and his men. I came on the scene maybe an hour after. There was one survivor, Miss Whitfield, and the child." Charles Brennan set the pencil down on the ledger very carefully, as if he were afraid of breaking it. He put both his hands flat on the counter. He looked down at his hands. "Emily," he said. "I'm sorry, sir." "Emily was bringing the baby home. She wrote from Helena. She said she was bringing the baby home for me to meet. Her husband was supposed to come with her, but he's a railroad surveyor, and they had him out in the Coeur d'Alene, and he couldn't get away, and she said she was going to come anyway. She said she couldn't wait." "Yes, sir." "She said she couldn't wait for me to hold her." Clara stepped forward. She held the baby out in both her arms. Her hands were steady, but her chin was not. "This is Sarah," she said. "Mr. Brennan, this is your granddaughter." Charles Brennan looked at the baby. He didn't move for a long moment. Then he came around the counter slowly, and he took Sarah out of Clara's arms with the careful, almost frightened grip of a big man who hadn't held a baby in 20 years. And he sat down on a crate of canned peaches, and he held his granddaughter against his chest, and he started to cry without making any sound at all. Clara turned her face away. Ethan stood there with his hat in his hands, and he didn't look at either one of them. He looked at a knothole in the floorboard. There was a small black ant crawling across it. He watched the ant. After a while, Charles Brennan wiped his face with the back of his wrist, and he said, in a thick voice, "Where is she?" "Buried by the creek at Sweetwater," Ethan said. "I marked it. You can find it from the road. It's the cottonwood with the lightning split in it about 20 paces in. I'll take you up there myself when you're ready." "I want to bring her home." "Yes, sir. We can do that. I want her in the ground here, in Bear Creek, not up on some pass." "Yes, sir." Charles looked down at Sarah. Sarah had her small fist closed around the edge of his apron. He looked at the fist a long time. "Miss Whitfield." "Yes, sir." "My daughter died with this baby in her arms." "Yes, sir." "And you stayed?" "Yes, sir." "In the road? With them maybe coming back?" "Yes, sir." Charles Brennan looked up at Clara, and there were tears still on his face, and he didn't bother wiping them. "I don't know you, Miss Whitfield." "No, sir. I don't know who you are or where you came from or what kind of woman you are. But you stayed with my granddaughter when most grown men would have run, and I will not forget that for as long as I live. Do you understand me?" "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Brennan. You will have a home in Bear Creek. You will have my home if you need it. You will have anything you need from this store, ever, and you will not pay for any of it as long as I am alive. Do you hear me?" "Mr. Brennan, that isn't necessary." "Do you hear me, Miss Whitfield?" She swallowed. "Yes, sir. I hear you." "All right, then." He looked back down at Sarah, and his face softened in a way that almost broke Clara to look at, and he said to the baby, "All right then, little one. All right. Granddad's got you. Granddad's got you now, Bob." They buried Emily Brennan 3 days later in the small cemetery on the hill above the creek, in a plot Charles Brennan owned because his wife was already there. There was no preacher in Bear Creek, so a man named Lemuel Hayes, who'd been a circuit rider before he took to drink and gave it up again, said a few words over the grave from a Bible he kept wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of his trunk. Clara stood at the graveside with Sarah in her arms. Ethan stood behind her. Charles Brennan stood next to the grave, and he did not speak, and his face was the face of a man who had aged 10 years in a week. There were maybe 30 people at the burial. Clara was surprised. She had expected 6. Some of them she recognized from the porch of the Copper Kettle, the men who had laughed at her as she rode in. They stood at the back with their hats in their hands, and they did not laugh now. After it was over, a woman came up to Clara. She was older, maybe 60, with iron gray hair and a face that had been beautiful a long time ago and was now something more interesting than beautiful. She wore a black dress that had been mended in 3 places that Clara could see. "Miss Whitfield?" "Yes, ma'am." "My name is Hannah Dvorak. I run the boarding house. Charles tells me you'll be teaching." "Yes, ma'am, if there's still a position." "There's a position. Whether there is a school is a different question. You've seen the building?" "I have. There are 19 children in this town between the ages of 6 and 14. 11 of them have never been to a school day in their lives. The other 8 had 2 months with a man named Pritchard the year before last, and the less said about him, the better. The town voted last winter to spend $40 on the roof. Then there was a fire at the smelter, and the $40 went to that. Then there was a flood in the spring, and the $40 went to that. The $40 has been spent 6 times now without leaving the town treasury." "I see. You have a room with me. Charles is paying for it out of pocket. I tried to tell him no, but he is not in a state to be told no this week, so I have stopped trying." "That's very kind of him." "It's very stubborn of him. There is a difference, but they look the same from the outside." Hannah Dvorak looked at her a long moment. "How old are you, Miss Whitfield?" 23. "You look younger." "I have been told that." "You will not look younger for long out here. I'm telling you so you know." "Yes, ma'am." "You will need different boots. The ones you have on will be ruined in a week. Come by the store tomorrow, and I'll show you what to ask Charles for. You will also need a heavier coat. Yours is a city coat. It will not last a winter here." "Thank you, Mrs. Dvorak." "Hannah." "Hannah. The older woman nodded once, and then she did something Clara did not expect. She reached out and she touched Clara's cheek, just briefly, with the back of her fingers. Then she walked away down the hill. Clara stood there with Sarah in her arms. Ethan came up beside her. "That woman just adopted you," he said. "Did she?" "She did. You don't know it yet, but she did." Clara looked at him. "Marshall." "Yes, ma'am." "You're leaving today." "Yes, ma'am, as soon as I can get supplies." "Where are you going?" Pike was last seen east of the divide. There was a holdup at a freight depot outside Townsend 2 weeks back, and a homesteader said he saw 5 men matching the description riding south toward the Crazies the day after. "I'm going to start at the depot and work backwards from there." 5 men. "Yes." "Against you." "That's how it generally goes, Miss Whitfield." She was quiet for a moment. "I told you I would not say it to you," she said, "but I find I am going to anyway. Be careful." He looked at her. Something in his face wanted to make a joke about it. Something else in his face wouldn't let him. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll be careful." "And come back through Bear Creek." That was the deal. That was the deal. He touched the brim of his hat, and he walked down the hill to where the bay was tied, and Clara watched him go, and she did not let her face show anything, because there were 30 people behind her who would see it. She did not see him for 4 months. The first week was the schoolhouse. She walked over to it the morning after the funeral with the borrowed boots Hannah had found her, and a list of supplies Charles Brennan had drawn up in his careful clerk's hand, and she stood in the doorway and looked at what she had to work with. The roof had caved in on the north side, just as Ethan had said. There were 2 desks left in the room. Long benches, really, scarred with a decade of penknife initials. The blackboard had been pried off the wall and taken. There were bird nests in 2 corners, and what she took at first to be a pile of rags, in the 3rd corner turned out to be a dead raccoon. She stood looking at the raccoon for a full minute. "All right," she said to nobody. "All right then." She had been raised in St. Louis in a house where the floors were waxed once a week and the windows were washed every other Tuesday, and she had never, in her 23 years, swept anything larger than a parlor. She went back to the boarding house, and she got a broom from Hannah Dvorak, and a pair of work gloves from the kitchen, and a burlap sack for the raccoon, and she walked back to the schoolhouse, and she started. She worked all day. She worked the next day. On the 3rd day, a boy of maybe 10 showed up in the doorway and stood watching her without saying anything. He was barefoot in November. His feet were blue. "Hello?" Clara said. The boy didn't answer. "What's your name?" The boy didn't answer. "My name is Miss Whitfield. I am the new teacher. Ain't no school." "There is going to be a school. I am building it back." "By yourself?" "It looks that way." The boy considered this. Then he walked into the schoolhouse and he picked up one end of the bench Clara had been trying to drag out of the room, and together they got it outside into the sunlight where she could see what was salvageable. He still hadn't told her his name. "Are you going to help me?" "Maybe." "Do you have a name?" "Wesley." "Wesley what?" "Wesley Pomeroy." "Wesley Pomeroy, do you have shoes?" "I had some. They broke." "Where's your mother?" "She died." "Your father?" "At the saloon, mostly." Clara nodded as if this were perfectly ordinary information. "Wesley, when we are done with this bench, you and I are going to walk over to Mr. Brennan's store and we are going to find you a pair of boots." "Ain't got money for boots." "I have money for boots, Wesley. My pa won't take charity." "Then we will tell him I am paying you a wage to help me with the school. And the first week's wage is a pair of boots. Will that suit him?" Wesley looked at her sideways, the way a feral cat looks at a held-out hand. "Maybe." By the end of the 2nd week, she had 4 of them. Wesley Pomeroy. A girl of 8 named June McAllister, who lived in a 1-room shack at the edge of town with her grandmother. Twin brothers named Eli and Asa Krestoff, who were Russian on their mother's side and didn't speak any English Clara could find, but understood a broom perfectly well. They came every morning after she paid Wesley for the boots, and they worked alongside her without being asked. And by the time the first hard snow came down on the 2nd Tuesday in December, she had a roof on half the building and a stove that drew, and a door that closed, and a single long bench she had built herself out of 2 old wagon planks, and a sawhorse from the livery. She did not have a blackboard. She had a piece of slate Charles had pulled out of a back closet at the store, big enough for one child at a time. She did not have chalk. She had a piece of soft white limestone Wesley brought her from the creek. She did not have books. She had her own copy of McGuffey's Second Reader that she had brought from St. Louis in her trunk, and a Bible Hannah Dvorak had given her, and a battered copy of The Last of the Mohicans that Charles had found in his late wife's things and pressed into her hands one evening at supper without saying anything about it. She made do. On the first day of school, she had 11 children. By the end of the first week, she had 14. By Christmas, she had 17. She taught them reading first, because reading was the door that all the other doors opened from. She taught them by making them sound out the words in the McGuffey reader and then writing those same words on the slate with the limestone chalk. She taught the twins their English by pointing at things and saying the words and having them say them back. She taught June McAllister, who could already read better than half the adults in town, how to do long division on the slate with a careful patience that made June look up at her sometimes with an expression Clara recognized and did not name. She kept Sarah with her at the school every day. She had a wooden crate Hannah had padded with quilting, and Sarah lay in it by the stove, and the children took turns rocking it with their feet while they did their sums. Charles Brennan came by every afternoon at 4 o'clock and took the baby home to his rooms above the store, and Clara walked back to the boarding house alone in the gathering dark. She did not let herself think about the marshal. She let herself think about him in the morning sometimes for a moment when she was lacing her boots, and at night sometimes when she was unbraiding her hair, and the rest of the day she did not think about him because she had decided she was not going to be a woman who waited. But she had asked him to come back through Bear Creek, and he had said he would. And she counted the days, even though she had told herself she wouldn't. Ethan was riding through country that didn't want him. He'd picked up Pike's trail at the freight depot in Townsend like he'd said he would, and it had taken him 3 weeks of hard work to come up on them at all. Pike was a careful man, smarter than the average road agent, and he moved his crew in small parties that came together only for jobs. Ethan had ridden up into the crazies in November snow and lost them. He had ridden back down to the plains and picked up a fresh thread at a roadhouse outside Big Timber, where a barkeep with a broken nose and a grievance told him in exchange for $10 and a promise of more that Pike's brother-in-law was running a small ranch up the Yellowstone where the gang holed up between jobs. Ethan had ridden 200 miles in 5 days to get there. The ranch was empty when he arrived. The fire in the stove was still warm. He sat in the empty kitchen of that ranch house in the snow, and he looked at the coffee cup somebody had set down maybe an hour before he came up the ridge, and he understood that he was hunting men who were also hunting him, or who knew, anyway, that he was hunting them, and were not going to be surprised the way he had hoped they might be. He rode back to Helena in early December to make a report and to draw fresh supplies and to wire the marshal's office in St. Paul about reinforcements that he knew, even as he sent the wire, were not going to come. Helena was 30 miles southwest of Bear Creek. He could have ridden through. He thought about it the whole time he was in Helena. He sat in his room at the boarding house and he wrote out a letter to Clara Whitfield 3 times and tore each one up, and finally he wrote a short one that said, "Only Miss Whitfield, I am alive. The work is taking longer than I thought. I have not forgotten my promise." He gave it to a freighter heading up to Bear Creek, and he paid the man $1 to put it directly into her hand. He didn't go himself. He told himself it was because if he went, he wouldn't leave again, and the work wasn't done. He told himself a lot of things. He left Helena on the 15th of December, and he rode north along the Missouri, and on the 3rd day out, he was ambushed by 2 of Pike's men in a creek bottom, and he killed both of them before either of them got off a second shot. And he sat afterwards in the snow with his back against a cottonwood and his hands shaking, and he understood, in the cold, clear way a man understands these things when he is alone in the woods with 2 dead bodies, that Pike now knew exactly where he was, and that this thing was not going to be finished from a distance. He buried the 2 men because he did not like to leave them for the wolves, even men like that. And then he rode hard for the high country, and the snow came down behind him and covered his tracks, and the year turned over without him noticing. In Bear Creek, Clara hung a sheet of paper on the schoolhouse door that read, "School will resume on the 2nd Monday of January. 17 students are enrolled. Miss Whitfield." She hung it on the 23rd of December, and she walked back to the boarding house through 6 inches of new snow, and Hannah Dvorak met her at the door with the freighter's letter in her hand. This came for you. Clara took the letter. She read it once standing in the doorway with the snow blowing in behind her. She read it again sitting at the kitchen table with her coat still on. She read it a third time in her room with the door closed. Then she folded it very carefully along the creases the freighter had put in it, and she put it in the drawer of the small writing desk Charles had moved into her room, and she sat down on the edge of the bed, and she put her hands over her face, and she made one small sound that was not a word, and then she got up, and she went downstairs to help Hannah with supper, because there were boarders coming, and the potatoes were not going to peel themselves. That night, after the boarders had gone to bed, and the fire was banked, and the house was quiet, Hannah Dvorak came up the stairs and knocked on Clara's door. "Come in?" Hannah came in with 2 cups of tea. She set one on the writing desk in front of Clara, and she sat down in the rocker by the window with the other, and she didn't say anything for a long time. "He's alive," Clara said. "He's alive." That's what the letter said. 3 sentences. He's alive, and the work is taking longer than he thought. It would, with that bunch. Yes. Hannah rocked. The chair made a small, regular sound on the floorboard. "Clara." "Yes." "You're going to be all right." "I know that. I want you to know I know it too." Clara looked at her over the rim of the teacup. The older woman's face in the lamplight was kind and unblinking. "You haven't asked me anything," Clara said. "What is there to ask?" "Most people would ask." "I am not most people. Charles told me that the day you came in here." "What did he tell you?" Hannah smiled a little. "He said the new school teacher was a young woman who looked like she'd been blown sideways by a high wind and was still standing. He said you stayed by Emily in the road for an hour with men who might have come back. He said if anyone in this town gave you trouble, he would close his store to them for the rest of their natural lives. I have not heard Charles Brennan threaten a soul in 12 years. I made my judgments accordingly." Clara was quiet. "I don't know what I am to him," she said after a moment. "The marshal." "You don't have to know yet. He doesn't know what he is to me either." "Probably not." "That's a foolish thing to say. I have known him 6 days in my life." 6 days is enough for some things, Clara. 6 days is not enough for other things. You don't have to decide tonight which 6 days these were." Clara set the teacup down. She looked out the dark window at the snow falling past the lamp. "I have a school," she said. "I have a baby downstairs at Charles's that I am going to walk over to in the morning to feed. I have 17 students. I have a piece of limestone for chalk. I have you, and I have Charles, and I have a town that did not want me 3 months ago and that nodded to me on the street today. I have those things. I am not going to be a woman who sits in this room and waits for a letter. No, you're not. I'm going to be the woman who built that school. You already are, Clara." Clara looked at her. "Am I?" "Walk down the street tomorrow and listen to what they call you. You'll see." The 2 women sat for a while longer without speaking. The lamp burned low. Outside, the snow came down on Bear Creek and on the boarding house roof and on the cottonwoods around the schoolhouse, where 17 children were going to come back in January. And somewhere west of there, a man with a federal star pinned to the inside of his vest was riding in country where the snow covered his tracks, and the men he hunted him back. And Clara Whitfield, schoolteacher, 23 years old, sat in a small lamp-lit room in a frontier boarding house, and she did not cry. Because she had decided a long time ago, on the morning after the worst day of her life, that she was not going to be a woman who cried about things she had chosen. She finished her tea. She blew out the lamp. She lay down in the dark and she listened to the snow, and after a long time she slept. She slept, and the winter came down on Bear Creek the way Montana winters do, not as one weather but as a long argument between weathers, with thaws that fooled people into hanging laundry and blizzards that came up out of nothing and killed cattle in the open. Clara stopped counting the days she had not seen Ethan Cole. She started counting other things instead. The cords of wood Wesley Pomeroy and the Krestov twins hauled to the schoolhouse from the timber lot Charles let them use. The number of words June McAllister could spell without looking at the slate. The pounds Sarah Brennan put on between Christmas and the thaw. By February, the school had 21 students. By March, it had 24. The roof leaked in 2 places and the stove smoked when the wind was wrong, and Clara had given up on writing letters to St. Louis, asking for books because the freight cost more than the books, and she had decided instead that she would write her own. She wrote out her own primer in a leather-bound ledger Charles had given her, with the alphabet at the front and a list of words, and then short sentences, and then short stories Clara made up herself in the long evenings at the boarding house. Stories about a boy named Ned who lived on a ranch, and a girl named Pearl who could ride a horse better than her brothers, and a dog named Soldier who got lost in a storm and found his way home by following the smell of bread. She wrote them by lamplight, and Hannah Dvorak sat across the kitchen and mended sheets and said nothing about how late Clara stayed up. The town watched her. She did not understand at first that it was watching her. She had thought when she came in November that Bear Creek would either decide she was foolish and ignore her or decide she was useful and tolerate her. She had not expected the third thing, which was what actually happened. It started small. A man named Hollis Webb, who ran the livery, sent a boy over to the schoolhouse one morning in late January with a kerosene lantern and a can of oil and a note that said, "For the school marm." From a fellow who can read on account of one like her 30 years back. Clara held the note in her hand for a long minute before she folded it into her ledger. Then Mattie Coombs, who washed laundry out of a shed behind the copper kettle, and who Clara had been told in careful sideways language was not the sort of woman she should be seen speaking to, came up to her on the street one afternoon and pressed a small parcel into her hands and said, "For the baby. Don't you say nothing to nobody about where it come from." Clara opened it that night at the boarding house. It was a knitted bonnet in pale blue wool with a small white flower stitched at the crown, and it was the finest piece of needlework Clara had ever held. She wore it on Sarah herself the next Sunday, walking down the main street of Bear Creek in plain sight of everyone, and when she passed the copper kettle, she lifted her chin and she nodded to Mattie Coombs through the window, and Mattie Coombs put her hand over her mouth and turned away. By March, the men on the porch of the copper kettle stood up when she walked past. She did not know what to do with it. She had not asked for it. She walked to the school every morning at 7, and she walked home every evening at 5, and in between she taught 24 children to read and write and figure. And she had not done anything that struck her as deserving of a man taking off his hat. But the hats came off. And Hannah Dvorak said one night across the kitchen table, "You don't see it because you are inside it, Clara. You are the only thing in this town in the last 2 years that has gone in the direction of better. People notice that. They don't always say it out loud." The other thing Clara did not see until Charles Brennan sat her down at his kitchen table one Sunday afternoon in March with Sarah on his knee, was that she had become, in some way she had not chosen, the mother of his granddaughter. "Clara," he said. "Charles, I need to say something to you, and you're going to let me say it." "All right. I am 61 years old. My wife has been gone 12 years this April. My daughter is dead. I am not going to live forever, and even if I were going to live a long time yet, I am not the right person to raise a baby girl. I am a shopkeeper, Clara. I open the store at 6, and I close it at 8, and I count receipts until midnight. I love this child more than I have words for, but I am not what she needs. Charles, I am not finished, Clara. Let me finish." She closed her mouth. "I have been watching her with you since November. She knows you. When she cries in the night and I bring her down the stairs to walk her, the first place she looks is the door. She is looking for you. She has been looking for you since she was 4 months old, and she has not stopped, and she is not going to. I am not asking you to take her from me. I am her grandfather, and I will be her grandfather as long as I am drawing breath. But I am asking you to be what you already are to her, and not to pretend you aren't. That's what I'm asking." Clara looked down at her hands. "Charles." "Yes?" "I do not know what I am doing." "Nobody does. That is not the relevant question." "What is the relevant question?" "Whether you love her." She looked up. "Yes," she said. "I love her." "Then that is the only thing that matters, and the rest of it we will figure out as it comes." It was the longest speech he had ever heard Charles Brennan make. He set Sarah down on the floor, and Sarah, who had just learned to crawl that week, crawled directly across the kitchen floor to Clara and pulled herself up against Clara's knee and pressed her face into the wool of Clara's skirt. Clara put her hand on the small warm head, and she did not say anything for a long time. That night she wrote her second letter to the marshal. She did not send it. She put it in the drawer with the first one he had sent her, and she did not read either of them again. He came back into Bear Creek on the 18th of April. It was a Tuesday. The thaw had finally settled in, and the streets were a brown mud the boys at the livery had laid boards over in the worst places. Clara was at the school. She had 13 students that day because the older ones had been kept home to help with the calving, and she was teaching the younger ones the multiplication table for sixes with Sarah asleep in the wooden crate by the stove, and the door opened and one of the Krestov twins, Eli, came in red-faced from running.
Miss, Eli, what is it? Marshall's back. He just rode in." The children all turned to look at her at once. Clara set down the limestone chalk very carefully on the small slate she had been writing on. She put her hands flat on the table in front of her. She drew one breath. "Children," she said, "recite the sixes for me out loud while I step outside. June, you lead." "Yes, Miss Whitfield." 6 times 1, 6, the children said.
Clara walked out of the schoolhouse with her hands folded in front of her at her waist so that they would not show that they were shaking. She walked down the long path through the cottonwoods and she came out onto the main street, and at the far end of it she saw the bay gelding tied in front of the marshal's office. And she saw a man standing on the porch of the office with his hat in his hand talking to the old Sheriff Birdsong. And the man was thinner than she remembered, and there was a bandage wrapped around his right hand that came up almost to his elbow under the sleeve of his coat. He looked up. He saw her at the other end of the street. He didn't move for a moment. Then he came down off the porch and he started walking toward her. And Clara, who had told herself for 5 months that she was not going to be the kind of woman who ran in the street, did not run. She walked. She walked at the same pace he was walking, and they met in front of the boarding house. In the mud, with the whole town watching from windows and doorways, and from the porch of the copper kettle. And she stopped 2 paces from him, and she put her hands behind her back so she would not do anything foolish with them. "Marshal Cole?" "Miss Whitfield." "You are alive." "Yes, ma'am." "Your hand." "It's all right. It's healing." "What happened to it?" "Got it in the way of something I shouldn't have." "Where?" "South of the muscle shell, about 6 weeks back." She looked at the hand. The bandage was clean but not new. He had wrapped it himself, she could tell. There was no woman's hand in that wrapping. "You're done." "I'm done with the territory work, yes, ma'am. Pike and 3 of his men are sitting in the federal lockup in Helena waiting on a judge. The 4th one is dead. So is the one who put the bullet through this." He lifted the hand a half inch and let it fall again. "I came back through to tell you. I said I would." "Yes. And to ask you something." "All right." He looked at her. She had not remembered in 5 months the exact gray of his eyes, and now she remembered. "Not in the street," he said. "No, not in the street." She turned and walked to the boarding house, and he followed her, and Hannah Dvorak was already standing in the doorway with a face that was trying very hard not to do anything, and Hannah said, "I will be at the school with the children, Clara. Take as long as you need." And she walked out past them down the boardwalk, and Clara closed the door of the boarding house behind them and turned around. "Sit down, Marshall." "I'll stand. Sit down." He sat down at the kitchen table. He set his hat on the table beside him. She poured him a cup of coffee from the pot on the back of the stove, and she set it in front of him and she sat down across from him. "Tell me," she said. "They are going to hang Clara." It was the first time he had used her given name. He said it like he had been practicing saying it for 5 months in his head, and was only now finding out what it sounded like out loud. "All 4 of them?" "The 3 living ones. The trial will be in Helena in June. The prosecutor wired me 10 days ago. He wants you to testify." Clara was quiet. "Me?" "You are the only living witness, Clara. You saw their faces. 2 of them you can name because I have prisoners now who will name themselves and the others to save their own necks. But the jury is going to want to hear it from a person who was there. I told the prosecutor I would not bring you into it without asking you first." "I see. You can say no. I want you to know that before you say anything else. You can say no and they will still hang, most likely, on the other evidence. It is not certain, but it is likely. And if I say no and they do not hang, then they go to prison for a long time, 20 years, 30. Pike won't see daylight either way. And if I say yes," he looked at her, "then you will sit in a courtroom in Helena and you will look at the men who killed Emily Brennan and you will tell what you saw. And the lawyer for the defense will try to make you say you did not see what you saw, and he will try to make you doubt yourself, and you will not enjoy any of it. And when it is done, they will hang for certain." "All right, Clara." "All right, Marshall, I will do it."
You don't have to answer right now. I am answering right now.
Clara, please. I want you to think about it. I have thought about it for 5 months, Marshall. I have thought about it every night since November. I knew you were going to ask me sooner or later. I knew it the day I climbed up behind you on that horse outside Sweetwater Pass. My answer has been the same since then, and it is the same now. I will do it. He looked at her across the kitchen table. There was something behind his face that he was not letting come forward, and Clara saw it, and she did not press him on it because she understood, finally, that the things behind Ethan Cole's face came forward only when he chose, and not before. "All right," he said. "All right." He took a drink of the coffee. His hand was steady on the cup, but Clara could see the small lines around his eyes that hadn't been there in November. "There is one other thing."
Yes. I need to see her. Sarah. Yes. Clara stood up. She is at the school. With Hannah. Come on. He stood up. He picked up his hat. They walked down the boardwalk together in the spring mud, and Clara did not take his arm and he did not offer it, but they walked close enough that the back of her hand brushed the back of his hand twice between the boarding house and the schoolhouse, and neither of them said anything about it.
At the schoolhouse, the children had stopped reciting the sixes and were sitting in 2 long rows on the bench Clara had built with the wagon planks, and Hannah Dvorak was at the front of the room with Sarah on her hip. And when Ethan came in through the door behind Clara, every one of the children turned to look at him in a single quiet motion. He was a stranger to them. He was also not a stranger because they had heard about him. He stopped just inside the doorway. He took his hat off. "This is Marshall Cole," Clara said. "He is a friend of mine." Hannah came down the aisle with Sarah and held the baby out to Ethan. And Ethan, who had not held a child since he was a child himself, took her with the same careful, frightened grip Charles Brennan had used in the Mercantile in November. Sarah looked up at him. She was 11 months old now, and she had her mother's dark hair and her grandfather's heavy brow and a small, serious mouth that was entirely her own. She looked at Ethan a long moment. Then she reached up with one hand and she put it flat against the white scar that ran from the corner of his eye down into his beard. Ethan did not move. Sarah patted the scar twice, the way a person tests a thing to see if it is hot, and then she withdrew her hand and tucked her head against the front of his coat and was content. 24 children watched this happen without a sound. "Well," Hannah said briskly from the side. "Children, this is the Marshal. He has come a long way and he is tired, and we are going to let Miss Whitfield speak with him in a moment. June, would you lead the class in the sevens, please?" "Yes, Mrs. Dvorak." 7 times 1, 7, the children said raggedly, still watching Ethan. Ethan handed Sarah back to Clara, and his hand brushed Clara's as he did it, and he looked at Clara over the baby's head, and his face did the thing it had not done at the boarding house, which was let something come forward. "I'll be at the marshal's office," he said quietly, "when you are done for the day." "All right." "Clara." "Yes." "I am glad to see you." "I am glad to see you too, Marshal." He nodded once. He put his hat back on. He walked out. Clara turned around to her class with Sarah on her hip. 24 children were looking at her and not at the slate. "Eyes forward, please," she said. "We were on the sevens." "Miss Whitfield," said June McAllister. "Yes, June." "Is the Marshal going to stay?" Clara opened her mouth to answer and found she did not have an answer. "That is a question," she said, "for the Marshal. Eyes forward, 7 times 2. 14, the children said. The trial was set for the second week of June. She rode down to Helena in the back of Charles Brennan's freight wagon with Sarah and Hannah Dvorak, and Charles himself driving, and Ethan rode the bay alongside the whole way, and they made the trip in 3 days because Charles would not push the team for the sake of a baby. They put up at a boarding house run by a German woman who had known Hannah for 20 years, and on the morning of the trial, Clara dressed in a plain black wool dress Hannah had altered for her, and she walked into the courthouse on Ethan's arm because her knees would not have carried her up the stairs otherwise, and she sat in the front row of the gallery and she waited. The courtroom in Helena was bigger than any room Clara had ever stood in. It had a high ceiling with a brass chandelier and rows of dark walnut benches and a railing in front of the judge's bench and a witness chair set off to one side. And when the bailiff brought in the 4 prisoners in their chains, Clara made herself look at them, one by one, and she did not look away. Garrett Pike was the second one in. He was a smaller man than she had expected.
lean and dark, with a thin mouth and pale eyes that found her in the gallery within 10 seconds of his coming through the door. He looked at her. He held the look. Clara held it back.
She had thought, in the 5 months since Sweetwater Pass, that she would be afraid in this moment. She had practiced for it. She had imagined the room and the chains and the eyes, and she had told herself many times that she was going to shake and that she was going to find the shaking acceptable. She did not shake. She looked at Garrett Pike across a courtroom in Helena, Montana, and she found, with a small surprise, that what she felt was not fear but something colder and more useful, and she did not look away until the bailiff put a hand on Pike's shoulder and turned him toward the defendant's table. Ethan, beside her, said nothing, but she felt his hand find hers on the bench between them, and she felt him squeeze it once, and she did not look at him. They called her in the afternoon. She walked up the aisle and she put her hand on the bailiff's Bible, and she swore the oath, and she sat down in the witness chair, and the prosecutor, a small fast-talking man named Holloway, walked her through it. The boarding, the departure from Helena, the road through the timber, the first shots, the faces in the windows, the flour sacks with the eyes cut out, Emily Brennan reaching for the baby, the shot. "Miss Whitfield," Holloway said, "I want you to look at the 4 men at that table. Take your time. And I want you to tell this court whether any of them was at Sweetwater Pass on the afternoon of September the 22nd, 1879. Clara looked at the table. She looked at Pike first because she had decided beforehand that she would, then at the heavy man on his left, who had been the one to look through the window of the coach and laugh, then at the youngest one, who could not have been more than 19, who had held the horses, then at the fourth, who she had only glimpsed from the rear window as the coach went over. "That is the man who shot the driver," she said, pointing. "I do not know his name. I saw him take the sack off as they rode out. He had a scar on his jaw here on the left side. The one in chains has the same scar." The prosecutor nodded. "Continue. The man on his right is the man who looked into the coach. He was the one who shot Emily Brennan. He laughed when he saw the baby, and then he shot her. I will remember his face for the rest of my life, and there is no possibility that I am mistaken about him." The heavy man at the table did something with his mouth that was almost a smile. Clara did not look away. "The boy on the end was holding the horses. I saw him through the window when the coach was on its side. He was crying. He kept telling the others to stop. They did not stop. The boy at the end of the table dropped his head. And the fourth man is Garrett Pike. He is the one who gave the orders. He is the one who said, after Emily was shot, to leave the baby because a crying baby will draw the wolves first. Those were his exact words. I heard him say them. I was on the ground behind the rear wheel of the coach, and he was not 10 feet from me, and he said, 'Leave the baby. The wolves will get to her before anything else,' and they rode out." The courtroom was entirely silent. Garrett Pike was looking at her. His pale eyes had not changed. "Miss Whitfield," the defense lawyer said when his turn came. He was a tall man in a good coat from Chicago, and he had the patient, almost gentle voice of a man whose job it was to make truthful people doubt themselves. "How long were you on the ground behind that wheel?" "Approximately 40 minutes. 40K. "And during those 40 minutes, you were behind the wheel and could not see the men with the sacks over their faces. Is that correct?" "That is correct for part of it." "For all of it, Miss Whitfield. Is that not correct?" "No, sir. It is correct that I could not see them through the wood of the wheel. It is not correct that I could not see them at all. There are gaps between the spokes." "Gaps between the spokes." "Yes, sir. The wheel of a Concord coach has 8 spokes. There are gaps between them. I watched the men through the gaps for 40 minutes. I had a great deal of time to look at them, sir. I was not going to forget." The defense lawyer paused. "Miss Whitfield," he said more quietly, "were you afraid?" "Yes, sir. I was very afraid. A frightened witness can be a mistaken witness." "A frightened witness can be many things, sir. Mistaken is one of them. Certain is another. I was both frightened and certain. I am still both, and I will remain both for the rest of my life. And there is nothing you can say to me in this room today that will change either one of those things." The lawyer from Chicago looked at her across the courtroom a long moment. "No further questions," he said. She walked back to her seat in the gallery on legs that were not entirely under her own command, and she sat down next to Ethan, and she did not look at the men at the defendant's table, and she did not look at Ethan either. She looked at her own hands folded in her lap, Ethan put his hand over both of hers, and he did not say anything. He did not need to. The jury was out for 90 minutes. When they came back in, the foreman read the verdicts in a flat voice that did not pause between the names, and after each name he said the word guilty. And when he had said it 4 times, the judge thanked the jury, and he set the date of sentencing for the following morning, and he said 1 or 2 other things that Clara did not really hear because there was a high, thin sound in her ears that had started when the foreman stood up and would not stop for almost an hour. Outside on the courthouse steps, the afternoon light was the gold color it gets in Montana in early June, and Hannah Dvorak was waiting with Sarah on her hip, and Charles Brennan was standing behind Hannah with his hat in his hands. Clara walked down the steps with Ethan beside her, and she took Sarah out of Hannah's arms, and she pressed her face against the baby's hair, and she stood there in the sun on the courthouse steps in Helena, Montana, and she did not cry because she had decided in November that she was not going to be a woman who cried about things she had chosen. Ethan stood next to her. After a while, he said, "Clara, yes, walk with me." She handed Sarah back to Hannah, and she walked down off the courthouse steps with the marshal, and they walked together along the wooden sidewalk in Helena, past the bank and the assay office and the telegraph and the dressmaker's window. And they came at last to a small park at the end of the street where there was a single iron bench under a young elm tree, and Ethan stopped there and he turned to her. "Clara." "Yes, Marshal. I'm going to say something to you and I'm going to say it badly." "All right." "I have spent 14 years doing what I do. I have been good at it. I have not been good at very much else, and I have not wanted to be. And I have built a life that fit me the way an old coat fits, and I have not wanted any other coat. Do you understand what I am telling you?" "I think I do." "I do not want it anymore." She looked up at him. "I do not want it anymore, Clara. I have ridden a long time alone, and I do not want to ride alone any further. I came back from the Muscle Shell in February with a hole in my hand, and I sat in a cabin for 3 weeks waiting for it to close up enough to ride, and the only thing I thought about in those 3 weeks was you sitting at a kitchen table in a boarding house in Bear Creek with your hands around a cup of coffee. That is the only thing I thought about. I want you to know that. I do not have a speech for this, Clara. I do not know how to say this any better than I am saying it. Marshal, I am asking you to marry me." She looked at him. The high, thin sound in her ears, the one that had started in the courtroom, stopped. She did not say anything for a long moment. "Ethan." "Yes. I have not been called by my given name by anyone but Charles and Hannah in 5 months." "I know." "Say it again." "Clara." "Say it again." "Clara, marry me. Come home with me to Bear Creek and marry me." She put her hands up to her face. She kept them there a long moment. When she took them down, her eyes were wet and her mouth was not steady, and she said, "Yes, Marshal Cole." "Ethan." "Yes." He pulled her against his coat, and he held her there. And they stood like that on the wooden sidewalk in a small park in Helena, Montana, under a young elm tree, and a wagon went by on the street behind them, and the driver did not look at them twice because in that country, in that summer, there were always people on sidewalks holding on to each other for reasons no stranger needed to ask about. They walked back to the courthouse without speaking and without letting go of each other's hands, and Hannah Dvorak saw them coming from a block away. And she did not say anything either, because some things did not need to be said in words. They were married in Bear Creek on the 3rd Saturday in July. Hannah Dvorak had wanted it sooner. Charles Brennan had wanted it sooner still. He had ridden back from Helena in the wagon, and inside of 2 days he had moved a carpenter and a glazier into the empty rooms above his store and started building Clara and Ethan a house. Not a cabin, a house. 2 stories of milled lumber on a stone foundation on a lot Charles owned at the bend of the creek a 1/4 mile from the school, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front and 4 windows facing east to catch the morning sun. He had drawn the plans himself on butcher paper at the kitchen table the night they got home, and when Clara had tried to say something about expense, he had set the pencil down and looked at her over the top of his spectacles and said, "Clara, I have 1 daughter buried on that hill and 1 granddaughter alive on this earth, and the only person in the world the granddaughter has chosen for a mother is you. We are not going to have a conversation about expense. We are going to have a conversation about whether you want the windows on the east side or the south side, and then we are going to build the house." She had chosen east. The house was not finished by July. They were married anyway in the schoolhouse because the church Bear Creek had been talking about building for 6 years had not yet been built, and because Clara had said, when Hannah pressed her on where, that the schoolhouse was the only place in town that felt like hers. Lemuel Hayes married them, the same man who had spoken over Emily Brennan's grave the November before. He had been sober for 9 months by then, and his voice was steady, and he wore a black coat that Charles had paid to have brought up from Helena on the freight wagon. He stood at the front of the schoolhouse where Clara had stood every morning for 8 months, in front of the long bench Clara had built with the wagon planks, and he read out the words of the marriage from a small leather-bound book he had carried with him a long time. And Clara stood in front of him in a pale gray silk dress Hannah Dvorak had been making in secret since April out of a bolt of cloth Charles had ordered from Chicago. Ethan wore a black coat too. He had shaved that morning, and the scar under his eye showed white against the line of his jaw, and Clara, looking up at him while Lemuel Hayes spoke, thought she had never seen him so still. He had been a man in motion the whole time she had known him. Now, in this 1 hour of his life, he was not moving at all. The schoolhouse was full, every bench Clara had built, and every chair Charles had brought over from the store, and the floor besides. There were maybe 100 people in a building meant for 40, and the rest of the town was on the porch and in the yard and along the path through the cottonwoods, because every soul in Bear Creek had decided, without anyone calling a vote, that this was a wedding they meant to attend. Wesley Pomeroy stood in the front row in new boots and a hand-me-down jacket Charles had altered for him at the store. June McAllister stood next to him, holding a bunch of wild yellow clematis she had picked herself in the timber that morning. The Krestov twins stood behind them in matching shirts their mother had washed twice. Sarah Brennan, 14 months old, walked the aisle on her own 2 feet in a small white dress Hannah had been making since May. She walked unsteady but determined, and when she got to the front, she sat down on Charles's boot and put her thumb in her mouth and watched the ceremony with the same serious mouth she had been watching the world with since she was 4 months old. When Lemuel Hayes said the words, and Ethan said, "I do," his voice carried across the room without him raising it. When he said the words to Clara, and Clara said, "I do," she said it twice. Once too soft to hear, and then again because Hannah Dvorak made a small sound from the front row, and Clara understood she had whispered it. The second time she said it loud enough that the people on the porch heard her, and they passed it back through the yard. She said it, the way a piece of good news travels in a crowd that has been waiting on it. Ethan kissed her. He kissed her once, briefly, the way a man kisses his wife when he means it but does not want to make a spectacle in front of 100 people. And then Lemuel Hayes closed his book and said, "Folks, Mr. and Mrs. Cole." And the schoolhouse came apart in a noise like nothing Clara had ever heard. The men of the town had built a long table out of planks and sawhorses in the yard. The women had brought every dish that could be brought without spoiling. Hannah had baked 4 cakes. Mattie Coombs, who had stayed in the back during the ceremony, had brought a 5th, frosted in white and decorated with sugared violets. She had pressed herself out of the spring meadow, and when Clara walked out of the schoolhouse on Ethan's arm, Mattie was standing by the table with the cake on a board in front of her, and Clara walked straight to her and took her face in both hands and kissed her on the cheek in front of the whole town, and Mattie Coombs, who had not been embraced by a decent woman in 15 years, did not know where to put her eyes. Hollis Webb played a fiddle. A man from the freight company who was passing through had a banjo. Wesley Pomeroy and June McAllister danced together with the serious concentration of 2 children who had agreed beforehand that they were not going to make a hash of it. Charles Brennan danced with Hannah Dvorak and then with Clara, and when he danced with Clara, he held her at arm's length and looked at her a long moment and said, "Emily would have loved you, Clara. She would have loved you the way I do." Clara could not answer him. She put her face against his shoulder for a moment, and he held her there, and then the fiddle started up again, and Ethan came across the yard, and Charles handed her to her husband, the way a father hands over a daughter. And Clara danced with Ethan in the long summer evening, with the cottonwoods turning gold behind them and the whole town watching. She thought, in the middle of the dance, that she had never been a person who imagined being happy. She had not been raised to it. She had been raised to be useful and to be patient, and to expect from life roughly what life delivered. And now, in a schoolyard in a frontier town she had not known existed 11 months ago, she was happy in a way she could not have described to the person she had been on the stagecoach out of Helena. The person she had been on the stagecoach out of Helena would not have recognized her. She looked up at Ethan. "Marshal Cole." Mrs. Cole, I am happy. I know. I did not know that I could be. I did not either, he said. About me. They finished the dance. The house was finished in October. They moved into it on the first cold day of the fall, the day the leaves of the cottonwoods finally turned and started to come down. Charles had built it with 2 bedrooms on the upper floor, a kitchen and a parlor, and a small study below, and a covered porch with 2 rocking chairs already on it because Hannah Dvorak had bought the chairs at a furniture sale in Helena in August and shipped them up on the freight wagon as a gift. There was a stove in the kitchen that drew properly. There was a window in the parlor with real glass and not the oiled paper most of Bear Creek made do with. There was a small room off the kitchen with a crib in it that Charles had built himself, with the rails sanded smooth and a small wooden horse carved into the headboard. Sarah slept in the crib that first night. Clara stood in the doorway and watched her sleep for almost an hour. Ethan came up behind her without making any noise. He never made noise when he walked, and he put his hands on her shoulders and stood with her. She is asleep, Clara. I know. You can come to bed. In a minute. All right. He stood with her. After a while, she said very quietly, I'm afraid sometimes. Of what? That something will happen to her. I know. That I will lose her the way I almost lost her. I know, Clara. I do not say it in the daylight. You can say it to me. You can say it to me any time you want, and you do not have to wait until it is dark. She turned around against him. She put her face against his shirt. I love you, she said. I love you too. It was the 3rd or 4th time he had said the words to her, and the 3rd or 4th time she had said them back, and she still was not used to the sound of either side of the exchange. She did not think she ever would be. She did not want to be. The school took on a different shape after that. Clara had been teaching at the schoolhouse every weekday since January, but the work had been a thing she did alone. Now she had a husband who walked her there in the morning and walked her home at night, and she had a daughter. She had begun to think of Sarah as a daughter without ever quite deciding to, and once she noticed she had begun, she did not stop. Who came with her every day and sat in a small chair Wesley Pomeroy had built her by the stove and listened to the lessons with the same serious expression Sarah used for everything she did. And she had, by the second winter, 31 students. She had to expand. The roof leaked again in November, and Ethan and Charles and Hollis Webb and 4 men from the freight company tore it off and put on a new one in 3 days. And while they were up there, Clara had Wesley and the older boys measure off another 12 feet of length on the east side. And by the time the snow came down, the schoolhouse was longer than it had been, and the bench Clara had built with the wagon planks was joined by 3 more benches and a real blackboard Charles had ordered from Chicago on a 30-day shipping promise that had only taken 60. She started teaching a second class in the evenings for adults. She had not planned to. It had started when Mattie Coombs came to her one afternoon in late October, after the men had cleared out of the schoolhouse and the children had gone home, and asked if Clara would teach her to read. I don't want anyone to know, Mattie said. I am 34 years old. It is humiliating. Mattie, I never had the chance, Clara. My mother was not a woman who valued it. I grew up in a road camp. I have been doing washing since I was 12. I cannot read the labels on the lye I buy. Mattie, come here in the evenings. I will teach you. Just me? Just you, if that is what you want. 2 evenings later, Mattie brought Hollis Webb's wife, who could read a little but could not write. 2 evenings after that, they brought a young rancher's wife named Sally Rowe, who lived 8 miles out and rode in once a week on a borrowed mule and stayed at the boarding house overnight so she could learn. By Christmas, there were 9 women in the evening class. By Easter, there were 14 and 3 men too, including Wesley Pomeroy's father, who had stopped drinking on his own without anyone asking him to, the spring after Wesley got his boots. Clara did not know what to do with any of it. She had set out to teach a school of children. She had ended up teaching a town. She wrote about it in a letter to her older sister Margaret in St. Louis, the only person from her old life who still wrote to her. Margaret, she wrote, I do not know how to tell you what is happening here. I had thought that what I was doing was small. I had thought that what I was doing was building one school in one town. I see now that I do not know what I am building. I do not think I am building it. I think it is building itself.
and I am only the woman standing where it happens. Margaret wrote back, in a hand Clara had not seen in 2 years. Little sister, you were always the one who saw what nobody else saw. You used to bring stray dogs home from the river when you were 6. You used to stand up at supper and ask the men why the maid was not also having pie. You have not changed. The town did not change you. You only finally got to a place where what was already in you had room. Keep going. M.
Clara read the letter 3 times, and then she put it in the desk drawer with the marshal's first letter and her own unsent one, and she went on with what she was doing. Ethan went back to work. He had told her in the small park in Helena under the elm tree that he did not want to ride alone any further, and he had meant it. But Bear Creek had not had a real lawman since Old Birdsong, and Old Birdsong had gotten worse over the winter Clara had been teaching. And by the spring of the 2nd year, Birdsong's hand shook so badly at the breakfast table that he could not lift a coffee cup, and he came to the marshal's office one morning in May, and he took the small brass star off his vest, and he set it on the desk, and he said, "Ethan, I am done. Whoever the next one is, it ain't me." So Ethan put the federal star back in the drawer where he had been keeping it since the wedding, and he took the small brass town badge that Birdsong handed him, and he became the sheriff of Bear Creek. It paid less than the marshal's work had paid. He did not seem to care. He came home for supper every night. He slept in his own bed every night. On Sunday mornings, he sat on the porch of the new house with Sarah on his knee and read her the headlines of the Helena Daily Herald in a serious voice as if she could understand them, and Sarah listened with the same serious expression she gave everything. He was not a perfect husband. Clara found this out in pieces, the way a wife always finds these things out. He was a quiet man, and the quiet sometimes went on too long, and when it did, Clara had to be the one to break it, and she did not always know how. He had moods that came down on him without warning, and that he could not always explain. There were nights in their first winter together when she would wake at 3 in the morning and find his side of the bed empty, and she would come downstairs and find him sitting at the kitchen table in the dark with no lamp lit, and he would look up at her and say only, "Go back to bed, Clara. I'm all right." And she would not go back to bed, but she would learn, slowly, that he did not want her to ask. She would sit across from him in the dark, and she would put her hand on top of his, and after a while he would speak or he would not speak. And either way, she would stay. He had lost more men in his life than she had known he had. He told her some of their names, eventually, over the course of years. He told her about a deputy named Will Tarver, who had taken a bullet meant for him in the autumn of 1874. He told her about a homesteader's wife in the Powder River country, who had bled to death on a kitchen floor while Ethan held her hand and waited for a doctor who came too late. He told her about a boy of 13 he had shot by accident in a dark stable in 1876, the boy having pulled what turned out to be a piece of pipe instead of a pistol, and Ethan having not known the difference until after. He told her these things on different nights, over different years, in pieces, in the dark, in her ear, with the small lamp out, and Sarah asleep in the next room, and the wind moving in the cottonwoods outside. She listened to all of them, and she did not flinch, and she did not try to fix any of them, because she understood that they were not things to be fixed. They were things to be told. In the late spring of the 3rd year of their marriage, she told him she was carrying a child. She told him in the kitchen, in the morning, with Sarah eating bread and butter at the table behind them and not paying attention to either of them. Clara had her hands on Ethan's chest, and she said it very simply, the way she said everything. And Ethan stood there a long moment without moving, and then he picked her up off the floor and held her against him, in a way he had not held her in a long time, and Sarah behind them said, "Mama, are you crying?" "Yes, baby, a little." "Why?" "Because I am happy." Sarah considered this. "Can I have more bread?" "Yes, baby, you can have more bread." The baby was born in February. It was a hard winter, and Clara was sick in the last month in a way that frightened both Ethan and Hannah. But the baby came on a clear, cold afternoon with the sun on the snow outside the bedroom window, and Clara delivered her quickly and without difficulty in the end, and when Hannah set her in Clara's arms, Clara looked down at her a long moment without saying anything. She had Ethan's gray eyes. She would not have his scar. She would not have any of the things he had carried. She would have the house at the bend of the creek, and the school down the road, and the schoolyard full of children who already knew her name before she was born, because Clara's students had been arguing about what to name the baby for 2 months and had settled finally on a list of 15 names which Wesley Pomeroy had written out on a piece of paper and presented to Clara with great seriousness the week before. Ethan came in. He sat down on the side of the bed. "Clara." "Yes." "Have you decided?" She nodded. She had decided in the fall, when she had first known. She had not told anyone, not even Ethan, because she had not wanted to say it before she could put the baby in his arms. "Emily," she said. Ethan did not say anything. "For her mother," Clara said. "For the woman in the green dress at Sweetwater Pass. We would not have any of this without her. I would not be in this house. I would not be in this bed. I would not have you, or Sarah, or this one. Emily Brennan gave me my life when she made me promise to keep hers. I want her name in this house." Ethan looked down at the baby in Clara's arms a long moment. "Emily Cole," he said quietly. "Emily Cole." He bent down and he kissed Clara's forehead, and then he kissed the baby's forehead, and he sat there beside the bed for a long time without speaking, and Clara did not need him to speak. Hannah brought Sarah in after a while. Sarah was 3 now, and she had been told by Charles that she had a new sister, and she came into the room with a serious expression, and she climbed up on the bed and she looked at the baby in Clara's arms a long, careful moment. "Mama?" "Yes, baby." "Is that her?" "That is her, Sarah. That is Emily. She's pink." "Yes." "Can I touch her?" Very gently. Sarah put one small finger against the baby's cheek. The baby did not stir. Sarah looked up at Clara. "I like her. I am glad. I am her sister. You are her sister. Forever. Forever, baby." Sarah nodded once, satisfied, the way she settled all the important questions of her life, and she lay down against Clara's shoulder and she watched her sister sleep. And outside the window, the snow on the cottonwoods caught the late winter sun and threw the light back into the room in pieces. Ethan put one hand on the back of Sarah's head and one hand on the back of the baby's head, and he sat very still on the side of the bed, and Clara closed her eyes, and the wind moved in the trees outside, and the small house at the bend of the creek held them all. Charles Brennan came up the stairs an hour later with a wooden cradle he had finished in his shop the night before. He had carved a small flowering vine into the headboard, and he set it down at the foot of the bed without speaking, and he looked at Clara, and he looked at the baby in Clara's arms, and he put his hand briefly over his eyes and turned away and went back down the stairs, and Hannah, who had been standing in the doorway, followed him. Clara heard them downstairs in the kitchen. She heard Charles Brennan, 64 years old, sit down at her kitchen table and put his head in his hands and weep without trying to hide it from anyone. She heard Hannah Dvorak set a kettle on the stove and not say anything to him because some things were not to be talked over. She heard Charles, after a long while, draw a breath that shook, and then say, in a thick, steady voice, "Hannah, we have 2 of them now." "Yes, Charles, we have 2. I did not think I would live to see it." "No, Charles, you did not, but you have." Upstairs, Clara held her daughter against her shoulder, and her other daughter, and she did not hesitate over the word now, neither in her head nor in her mouth. Lay against her side with one small hand on the baby's foot, and Ethan sat on the edge of the bed with his own hand on his wife's hair. And outside the window, the cottonwoods at the bend of the creek caught the last of the February sun and held it, gold against the snow, while the light in the room went slowly down toward evening. The light went down toward evening that February afternoon, and then it went down on a great many other evenings. And the years began to do what years do to people who stand still long enough to let them. Sarah grew first. She had Emily Brennan's dark hair and Charles's heavy brow and her own serious mouth. And by the time she was 6, she could read better than any other child Clara had taught. And by the time she was 9, she had started keeping her own small ledger of the schoolhouse expenses, because Clara, who could teach a child to multiply in her sleep, had a peculiar blindness when it came to her own arithmetic. Sarah corrected her mother's columns with a pencil and a small frown, and Clara watched her do it from across the kitchen table and thought, sometimes, that the woman in the green dress at Sweetwater Pass would have known her daughter by that frown alone. Emily Cole came after and was nothing like her sister. She had Ethan's eyes and Clara's hands and a laugh that started in her belly and came up out of her like water out of a spring, and she had been climbing things since she was 11 months old.
Charles had to build a rail around the upstairs landing the year she turned 2. He built it sturdy. He built everything sturdy. He had outlived a daughter, and he was not going to outlive a granddaughter. And Clara, watching him hammer the rail in with the slow, careful blows of a man past 60, understood that he was building it as much for himself as for the child.
They were sisters in the way that two children raised in the same house become sisters, which is to say they fought as hard as they loved and could not be separated from each other for more than half a day without one or the other coming to find the other. When Emily was 4 and Sarah was 7, they had a fight in the yard about a wooden horse, and they did not speak to each other for almost a full afternoon. And at supper, Sarah looked across the table at her sister and said, I am sorry I said your hair was stupid." And Emily said, "I'm sorry I broke the horse." And Ethan and Clara, who had been waiting for the thing to resolve itself, looked at each other across the table over the heads of their children and did not say a word. A third child came in 1886. A boy. They named him Tom, after Tom Halloran, who had taken Clara and Ethan in on the night after Sweetwater Pass, and who had died the spring before of a fever Maud could not break. Maud Halloran rode down to Bear Creek for the christening in a borrowed buggy, and held the baby in her lap a long time at the kitchen table, and she said, when she handed him back, "He has a good name, Clara. You picked a good name." "It is the only name we considered, Maud." "I know it. Tom knew it too. He said so the spring before he went. He said, if she has a boy, it'll be a Tom." He smiled when he said it. Maud died the next winter. Clara went to the funeral. She rode up with Ethan on the bay, and they stood by the soddy where she had slept that one night in November of 1879. And Clara looked at the small window where she had sat at the plank table in the dark before dawn and decided what she was going to do with the rest of her life. And she did not cry, but she stood there a long time. The school grew along with the children. By 1890, there were so many students that Clara could no longer teach them alone. The first year she hired a young woman from Helena, a Miss Anstruther, who was 19 and serious and stayed 2 years, and then married a doctor and moved to Butte. After her came a man named Jenkins, who lasted 6 months before the children ran him off. He had hit one of the younger boys with a ruler the second week, and Clara had told him very quietly, in front of the class, that if he ever did it again, he would walk out of the building that same afternoon. And when he did it again, she walked him out of the building that same afternoon, and the children clapped as she did, and Mr. Jenkins took the next stage to Helena and was not heard from in Bear Creek again. After him came June McAllister. June was 20 by then. She had finished her own schooling under Clara and then gone east on a railroad scholarship Charles had quietly funded. Clara had not known, for almost a year, that the scholarship came out of Charles's own pocket, and when she found out, she had walked into the store and put her arms around the old man without saying anything, and Charles had only patted her shoulder and said, "Hush, Clara. I have money and no use for it. The girl has a mind." June had come back from a teacher's college in Iowa with letters after her name and a brisk, practical manner that the children of Bear Creek had recognized within a single morning as the manner of a woman who had grown up among them and could not be fooled. She and Clara taught together for 12 years. Wesley Pomeroy went east too. He went to a college in Ohio that took him on Charles's recommendation, and on the strength of an essay, Clara helped him write about the difference between a boy who has boots and a boy who does not. He came back 6 years later as a lawyer, and he hung his shingle on a small office across from the marshal's office in Bear Creek, and he did not charge widows or homesteaders if he thought their case was a good one. By 1895, he was a federal judge in the territory. By 1900, he had argued a case before the Supreme Court in Washington. He never moved out of Bear Creek. He bought a house 2 doors down from Charles Brennan's store, and he lived in it the rest of his life. And once a month he came to supper at Clara's table and brought a bottle of good Kentucky bourbon for Ethan and a stack of new books for the school, and he would not let anyone call him Judge Pomeroy at that table. "In this house I am Wes," he said, the first time it came up. "I've not been Wes since I was 10 years old, and I miss it. Indulge me." And they indulged him. The Krestov twins took over the freight company. They learned English well enough to argue with bankers in it, and they kept the company solvent through 2 depressions and a railroad expansion that put a dozen other outfits under. And they were known in 3 states for not cheating anyone, ever, on anything, which the Krestov twins considered a basic matter of arithmetic and not a matter of virtue. Eli married a girl from Spokane in 1894. Asa never married, but he doted on Eli's children the way an uncle dotes when a brother has done the marrying for both of them. There were others. There were always others. The Whitmore boy went to medical school in Pennsylvania and came back as the first real doctor Bear Creek had ever had, and he set up his practice in 2 rooms above Charles's store, and he delivered Tom Cole's first son in 1908. A girl named Hattie Rowe, Sally Rowe's daughter, who had ridden the borrowed mule in for evening classes in Clara's first winter, became a journalist, and her dispatches from the Klondike and later from Manila were syndicated in 23 newspapers. She came home only twice. Both times she came to Clara's kitchen, and Clara sat across from her at the same table and listened to her talk about the things she had seen, and Hattie Rowe said both times the same thing as she left. "I would not have got out of this town if you had not taught me to read, Mrs. Cole. I want you to know that. I want you to know I know that." Clara, who had stopped trying to deflect such things by the time she was 40, said only, "I am proud of you, Hattie. I have always been proud of you. Come home more often." And Hattie said she would, and she did not. And Clara did not hold it against her because the work she had done in the schoolhouse had not been done to bring children back. It had been done to send them out. And she had sent them out, and they had gone. And that was what the work was. Charles Brennan died in 1898. He died in his bed above the store with Clara holding one of his hands and Hannah Dvorak holding the other, and Sarah, 20 years old by then, and a young woman in her own right, sitting at the foot of the bed reading aloud to him from a book of poetry he had loved. He had been ill for almost a year. He had refused to go to Helena for a doctor, and the Whitmore boy had done what could be done, which was not much. At the end he was very thin and very tired, and he was not afraid. He said that last afternoon, "Clara." "Yes, Charles?" "I have one thing to ask you. Anything. Do not let them put me on the hill next to Maria. Put me next to Emily." Clara nodded. Maria was his wife, dead since 1867. Emily was his daughter. They lay side by side at the top of the cemetery hill, the wife and the daughter. And there was a third plot beside Emily that Charles had bought 30 years earlier and never explained the purpose of, and Clara had always thought it was for him to lie beside his wife. "You want to lie beside Emily?" "I do." "Why, Charles?" He looked at her a long time. "Because Maria has had me all to herself for 30 years, he said, "and Emily was alone in the ground for 1 full hour before you got to her, Clara, and I have thought about that hour every day of my life since November of '79. I do not want her to be alone there again. I want to be next to her now. I want her to know her father came for her in the end." Clara could not speak. "You will arrange it." "I will arrange it, Charles." "Sarah." "Yes, Granddad." "Come here." Sarah closed the book and came up the side of the bed, and Charles took her hand in his thin hand, and he looked at her a long moment. "Sarah." "Yes, Granddad." "You are not mine by blood." "I am yours, Granddad." "Yes, you are mine. I want to tell you, though, what I have not told you outright in 20 years. Your mother's name was Emily Brennan, and she was my only daughter, and she was the bravest, sweetest, most stubborn person I ever knew, and you have her eyes and her mouth and her temper and her laugh. And in the 4 hours she held you on the road from Helena to Sweetwater Pass, she made one promise to one woman, and that woman is sitting on the other side of this bed, and that woman has kept that promise for 19 years. And that woman is your mother, Sarah, in every way that matters in this world. I want you to know that I know it. I want you to know that I am glad of it. I am dying very glad." He let go of her hand. He looked at Clara. "Thank you, Clara." "Charles, thank you, Clara, for staying." He closed his eyes. He did not open them again. They buried him on the hill beside his daughter, in the plot he had bought 30 years before for a purpose he had only just made clear. And Clara stood at the graveside with Sarah on one side of her, and Emily Cole on the other, and Tom holding her hand from behind, and Ethan stood behind all of them with his hat in his hand. The whole town of Bear Creek came to the funeral, and the line of people on the hill was longer than the line had been for Emily Brennan in 1879, because Charles Brennan had been a fixture in that town for 40 years and had quietly paid for more than half of what stood in it without ever telling anyone, and a great many people had figured this out by the end. Clara cried at that funeral. She had not cried at Maud Halloran's. She had not cried at Tom Halloran's. She had not cried at the small funeral of Lemuel Hayes, who had married her and Ethan and who had died sober in 1893. But she cried at Charles's. She stood at the edge of his grave, and she cried with both her hands over her face, and Ethan put his arm around her shoulders and held her there. And nobody in the line of people behind them said anything, because the whole town had been waiting for Clara to cry about something for 19 years and was relieved, in a strange way, to see that she finally could. Hannah Dvorak followed Charles in 1903. She was 78. She died sitting up in her chair at the boarding house with a piece of needlework in her lap and a cup of tea gone cold on the table beside her. And Clara, who came every Sunday to sit with her, found her that way at 3 in the afternoon with the sun on her face through the parlor window. She had left Clara the boarding house in her will. Clara turned it into a second schoolhouse, a teacher's college, in a small way, for young women from the surrounding country who wanted to learn the work but could not afford to go east. June McAllister ran it. The first class had 4 students. By 1910 it had 30 and was sending teachers out across 3 territories. Ethan kept on as sheriff of Bear Creek until he was 68. He was not always good at the work, and the work was not always good to him. He had a bullet taken out of his shoulder in 1894 by the Whitmore boy on the kitchen table of their own house. A drunk freighter in the Copper Kettle had gone for him with a pistol, and Ethan had not been as quick as he had been at 35, and he walked with a small stiffness on the right side after that for the rest of his life. He retired the year Tom was elected sheriff in his place. Tom was 26. The town voted for him almost unanimously, partly because he was his father's son, and partly because everyone in Bear Creek had known Tom Cole since he was an infant in a crib his grandfather had carved, and they trusted him with the badge the way you trust someone you have watched grow up. Ethan sat on the porch of the house at the bend of the creek every morning after that, with a cup of coffee and the newspaper, and Clara sat with him when she did not have school, and they did not always speak. The not speaking had become, over the years, its own kind of speaking. Ethan said, one morning in his 72nd year, sitting in the rocker Hannah Dvorak had given them for the wedding 41 years before, "Clara." "Yes." "Do you remember the morning at the Hallorans?" "Of course. You sat across from me at that plank table and you told me you were going to keep her. The baby. You told me you had promised Emily." "I remember. I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met." "I was not brave, Ethan. I was stubborn. It looks the same from the outside." That is what Hannah said about Charles once. Hannah was right about a great many things. They rocked. After a while he said, "I want you to know I have been happy." "I know, Ethan. I have not always said it. I have not needed you to say it. I am saying it now." "All right." He took her hand on the porch rail between the rockers, and they sat in the morning sun, and the cottonwoods at the bend of the creek were turning gold for the 42nd time since the house had been built, and Ethan Cole closed his eyes for a moment with his face in the sun, and Clara watched him, and she thought he looked younger than he had in years. He died that winter, peacefully, in their bed, with Clara holding his hand the way Hannah had held Charles's hand, and his last words to her were, "Don't follow me too soon, Clara. The school still needs you." And she said, "I won't, Ethan." And she did not. She lived another 11 years. She kept teaching. She was 83 years old the last time she stood at the front of a classroom, and she did it with a chair behind her because her knees were no longer reliable, but she did it. The schoolhouse by then was a real building with 2 stories and a bell tower and a proper library Wesley Pomeroy had paid for in his will. The original schoolhouse Clara had rebuilt with her own hands was still there beside it, preserved as a small museum, with the wagon plank bench inside and a piece of limestone chalk in a small glass case and a photograph on the wall of Clara at 25, taken by a traveling photographer who had come through in 1881, with her hair pinned back and her hands folded and an expression that did not give anything away. She had her daughters around her. Sarah had married a rancher's son named James Halloran. Yes, of those Hallorans, Maud's nephew, and lived 12 miles out on a ranch she had inherited from her grandfather Charles, and she brought her 4 children to Clara every Sunday for supper. Emily Cole had become a doctor, the second woman to graduate from the medical college at the University in Missoula, and the first to come back to a frontier town instead of a city.
and she practiced in the rooms above Charles's store that the Whitmore boy had retired from. Tom had been sheriff for 15 years and then territorial marshal for 10, and he had a son and a daughter of his own. There were 11 grandchildren by 1924. There would be more. Clara had stopped trying to count. One Sunday in the spring of that year, a woman came up the walk to the house at the bend of the creek. Clara saw her from the porch where she was sitting with a book in her lap. The woman was perhaps 45 years old, well dressed in a traveling suit, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, and a serious mouth. She came up the steps and stopped, and she looked at Clara a long moment without speaking. "Mrs. Cole." "Yes." "My name is Sarah Brennan." Clara set the book down on the small table. "Yes," she said. "I know who you are." "Do you?" "I have known who you are for 45 years, Sarah." The woman on the steps put her hand against the porch rail. She held it there a moment as if she needed it to keep her upright. Then she came up the last step and she sat down in the rocker next to Clara, Ethan's rocker, that nobody had sat in since he died, and she folded her hands in her lap. "I went to live with an aunt in Chicago when I was 3, she said. "My father, my real father, came back from the Coeur d'Alene and he could not raise a child alone, and his sister took me. She was a good woman. I had a good childhood. They did not tell me about my mother until I was 12. They did not tell me about you until I was 19. I have known about you for 26 years, Mrs. Cole, and I have not had the courage to come here until now. I do not know what I want to say. I had a speech in the train, and I forgot it." Clara reached across between the rockers, and she took the woman's hand. "You don't need a speech, Sarah." "I have a daughter," Sarah Brennan said. "I have 2. The older one is named Clara. I named her for you when she was born, and I have not told her why for 16 years because I did not want to come here and tell you about it until I had told her first, and I told her last month, and I came here on the train as soon as I could after." "You named your daughter Clara?" "Yes. I do not know what to say to you, Sarah." "You don't need to say anything either." The 2 women sat on the porch in the afternoon sun. Sarah Brennan, 45 years old, the orphan in the green-dressed mother's arms on the road at Sweetwater Pass, and Clara Whitfield Cole, 86, the schoolteacher from St. Louis, who had knelt in the dirt next to her and not run. They held hands, and they did not speak for a long time. The cottonwoods at the bend of the creek moved in a small wind. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck the hour. After a while, Sarah said, "My mother." "Yes." "What was she like?" Clara thought a long moment. "I knew her 4 hours, Sarah. I cannot pretend I knew her well. But what I knew of her was this. She was funny. She had a quick laugh. She was tired. She had come a long way with you, and you were teething, and she had not slept. She told me about your father, and she said he was a good man who was not always around, but who loved her, and that she did not mind the not being around as much as she might have because she had you. She gave me half her apple at the way station outside Helena because she thought I looked hungry, and I was not hungry, but I ate it anyway because she meant it kindly. And when the men came and she was already shot, and she could not hold you up by herself any longer, she did not waste her last 10 minutes on the men or on her own pain. She used it on you. She used every second of it on you. She made me promise. And I promised her, Sarah, and I have kept that promise every day of my life for 45 years, and I will keep it until the day I follow her. And I want you to know that the promise was not hard. I want you to know that. I want you to know that loving you was the easiest thing I have ever done." Sarah Brennan put her face into her hands and wept. Clara did not pull her hand away. After a long while, Sarah lifted her head and her face was wet, and she said, thank you, Mrs. Cole. Thank you for staying." Clara, it is the only thing I did, Sarah. It is the only thing that mattered. She lived until 1935. She died on a morning in September, 87 years and 7 months old, in the same bed where Emily Cole had been born and where Ethan had drawn his last breath. Sarah Halloran was beside her, and Emily Cole was beside her, and Tom had been called for and was riding hard from Helena, but did not get there in time. Clara was conscious until almost the end. She did not say very much. She held her daughter's hands and she looked toward the window where the morning light was coming through, and she said, once, very softly, "It is a beautiful day." And her daughter said, "Yes, Mama, it is." And a little while later she went. They buried her on the hill in Bear Creek.
They buried her next to Ethan, and next to Charles, and next to Emily Brennan, who had been waiting in that ground 45 years and had been visited by Clara almost every Sunday of all those years. The 4 graves lay in a row at the top of the hill above the creek, looking down at the schoolhouse Clara had rebuilt with her own hands. Half the state came to the funeral. 3 judges and 4 marshals and a senator and a great many ordinary people who had been her students or her neighbors or the children of her students. Hattie Rowe came home from where she was living in San Francisco, and she wrote a piece about the funeral that ran in 50 newspapers, and it was the most read piece she ever wrote, and the line in it that people quoted for years after was the simplest one. Most people on the frontier survived, Hattie Rowe wrote, by knowing when to run. Mrs. Cole became unforgettable because she did not. The worst day of her life, she sat down in the road, and a town grew up around the place she sat. That in the end was what the story was about. Not the school, though the school mattered. Not the marriage, though the marriage was a good one. Not even the promise, though the promise was the seed of all of it. The thing the story was about was a young woman of 23, half a continent from anyone who knew her name, who knelt in the dirt next to a dying stranger and did not move. The world had given her every reason to move. It had given her a wagon of dead bodies and the sound of horses' hooves still close in the timber and a road in front of her she could have walked down by herself. She stayed. She stayed because a stranger asked her to, and she went on staying. In that road, in that town, in that schoolhouse, in that house, at the bend of the creek, for the rest of her life. And everything good that came of her life came of that one decision to stay. There are easier lives than that. There are lives where the choice never comes up. Most of us, if we are honest, are quietly glad of it. But there is a kind of person who, when the choice does come up, knows what to do without having to think about it. And there is a kind of life that those people make, and that kind of life makes other lives possible. Clara Whitfield Cole was one of those people. She would not have said so. She would have said, if you asked her, that she had only been stubborn and that she had only kept a promise, and that anyone in her place would have done the same. But anyone in her place would not have done the same, and we all of us know it. And the proof of it is that we remember her name and not the names of the 4 people who came running up the road from the timber an hour after she had already decided to stay. In a hard country, in a hard year, in a road full of dead bodies, a young woman knelt in the dirt and refused to run. 45 years later, a town buried her on a hill above a creek and put 4 words on her stone, because 4 words were enough. The words on the stone read, Clara Whitfield Cole. She stayed. And below, in smaller letters, Sarah Halloran and Emily Cole had insisted on, against the carver's protest, that there was already enough, the words she had said on the porch of the house at the bend of the creek. The afternoon, a woman named Sarah Brennan came up the walk. Loving you was the easiest thing I have ever done. The wind moves in the cottonwoods above that stone on the hill in Bear Creek, Montana, and it has been moving there for a long time now, and it will be moving there for a long time yet. The schoolhouse below is still standing, the original one, with the wagon plank bench inside. Children still go up the hill on field days and look at the bench, and at the piece of limestone chalk in the glass case, and at the photograph of the woman at 25 with her hair pinned back, and the teachers tell them the story. The story is always the same story. A young woman in a road, a dying woman with a baby in her arms. A promise made in 4 hours and kept in 45 years. A town that grew up around the place she sat down. That is the whole of it. It is enough.